Welcome, and thank you again for joining us as we work through the parables of Jesus in our series called Fables and Folktales. Today we're talking about the parable of the vineyard workers. This particular parable is only found in the Gospel of Matthew, and it comes in sort of a sequence of events. And I think in order to get a good understanding of the parable, we have to understand what kind of happens before and after. So we're just going to look at the few verses before. Actually, the chapter before in Matthew 19.
Whole chapter?
No, we're just going to look at a couple of verses. That's you being serious? Okay.
Yeah.
This parable comes after Jesus is asked by a rich man how to enter the kingdom of heaven. And they have this sort of discourse. And the rich guy actually walks away unhappy because Jesus concludes his conversation with him by saying, in Matthew chapter 19, verses 23 and 24, he says, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, I tell you the truth. It is very hard for a rich person to enter into the kingdom of heaven. I'll say it again. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." To which his disciples were flabbergasted. They're like, how could this possibly be? Because in their culture, wealth was considered a God's blessing.
It's really almost not any different.
Yeah, I know.
In our culture,
we do have a little too much respect for the wealthy.
There's that. Yeah, wealth is sort of like, you're doing.
Yeah, you must be doing something right.
You know, there's something right.
Yeah.
God is. I think there's a lot of people who would use the word God as blessing.
Yeah. Absolutely. So at this point, the disciples, Peter especially, gets kind of bold and asks Jesus, what's in it for them, meaning the disciples, because they've kind of given up everything to follow Jesus. And Jesus says that they will be blessed, but then he sort of ends it with this confusing statement: the first will be last, and the last will be first. Or in some translations, the greatest and the least is substituted for first and last. And then in sort of a way of explaining what he means, he tells them this parable. This is the parable of the vineyard workers.
All right. "For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wage and sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace and saw some people standing around doing nothing. So he hired them, telling them that he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard. At noon, and again at 3 o'clock, he did the same thing. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he was there in the town again and saw some more people standing around. He asked them, 'Why haven't you been working today?' They replied, 'Because no one's hired us.' The landowner told them, 'Then go out and join the others in my vineyard.' That evening, he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first. When those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, they each received a full day's wage. When those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed that they would receive more, but they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested to the owner. 'Those people worked only 1 hour, and yet you paid them just as much as you paid us who worked all day in the scorching heat.' He answered one of them, 'Friend, I haven't been unfair. Did you not agree to work all day for the usual wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others? So those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last.'"
So there's that statement again.
There it is.
So let's just have a look at what's happening here. So this landowner has a vineyard. It's time for harvest. He goes to the town square or the marketplace and hires day laborers. And that practice still goes on even today.
It does.
So the typical work day for such workers was there's roughly 3-hour shifts. So started at 6 a.m. and finished at 6 p.m. Now the going rate for a full day of work was 1 denarius, which the landowner offered, and those hired in the early morning, they agreed to that amount.
That's right.
Now, from what I understand, this was a reasonable wage. It wasn't
above average or about average?
It's about average, but it's a good wage for a day laborer.
Okay.
And then the landowner hires more laborers at different times throughout the day, telling them that he would pay them what's right. And from my understanding from researching this a little bit is that they only expected to be paid a portion of the denarius based on how long they worked.
Right. So this is essentially the idea of like they're expecting kind of like an hourly wage.
Yeah.
I work this many hours, if whatever is the 12 hours is 1 denarii, whatever is,
So they would break it up. But that's not what the landowner does.
No.
So in those days, day laboring had many risks, and laborers were actually taken advantage of. So if they did not get to work that day, they and their families didn't eat. So they were in great need of working to support their families. Now, landowners would sometimes pay them less than the going rate,
Right.
even when the expectation is that they would going to be paid the going rate.
Right. So that's something even right there, just the idea of being a fair landowner. Just he's paying the going rate and it's the good rate as opposed to, like, especially if you're desperate, like this is setting up.
So he's not
if
trying to
somebody
take
comes and
advantage
saying,
of him,
well, I'll give you this. And like, I didn't work for the last 2 days.
Yeah.
I got to take something.
Exactly. So you're not taking advantage of the person's desperation. And then I've heard stories of even nowadays where landowners just kind of take the harvest and disappear and don't pay the workers at all. And they really have no recourse. They can't afford to hire a lawyer, and a lot of them are illegal immigrants. So there just isn't much that they can do. And I'm sure it was much the same then. But this landowner wasn't like that. He paid all the workers for a full day, even though some had only worked for 1 hour. Now this, I'm sure when Jesus was telling this, would have shocked his listeners.
Sure.
This was just outstanding, uncommon generosity. And obviously in this story, this didn't sell well with the workers hired for the first shift. Even though they agreed to work for the going rate, which was a good rate, and they were paid in full on time, they grumbled.
Right.
And I think it's easy for us to sympathize with them.
Sure. I would say, I don't know that I would feel any different if I saw the same thing.
Yeah.
Because I would be like, oh, wow, if he's given that, like, oh, what am I going to get? And so it would not seem fair. Yeah,
it just doesn't seem fair. So what point is Jesus trying to make? Well, I've heard many interpretations over the years. One parallel that I've heard is that it doesn't seem fair that people can kind of repent on their deathbed and still enter the kingdom of heaven. We think of like the thief on the cross, who lived obviously a life where he was being crucified for his actions, and yet he says, "Jesus, remember me," and Jesus says, "Yeah, you're in." It's like, well, that doesn't seem fair. And then there's sometimes when they talk about a vineyard, or prophets did, or priests did. It was in relation to the nation of Israel. So I've heard this theory about the workers who started early in the day represent the Jews, and those at the end of the day were the Gentiles. And so it doesn't seem fair that Gentiles can get in when the Jews have been sort of carrying the torch.
Because Jesus is clearly stating that this is about the kingdom of heaven and not really about the nation of Israel. Like because there are times when in his parables, he is really talking about about the nation Israel or religious leaders or whatever it might be that. But this is not that. He is really talking about the kingdom of heaven specifically.
Yeah, I looked this up, and most commentators agree that the vineyard represents the kingdom of heaven in the world at large, and not just the nation of Israel. And I think it's not really about how we become followers of Jesus or salvation. Jesus very clearly states that you don't get to be part of the kingdom of heaven by what you do. And there's nothing we can do to make ourselves worthy. And Paul reiterates that a lot.
Yeah, exactly. It goes back to when Paul said there's really no reason to boast.
Yeah,
nothing to boast in for this because it's God's grace.
Yeah, and a gift. So I guess we have to ask ourselves, so what is Jesus saying? So I think the thing that I most resonated with in researching this is the parable in the context of what happened just before and what happens shortly after. So in just before, we see the sort of interaction with the rich man and the disciples asking the question, what's in it for us? So they were obviously expecting some kind of reward for being a disciple. And I think Jesus is speaking to our motivation for working alongside him in his mission. It's not to gain his favor or to get a bigger reward. It's just out of gratitude of actually having a relationship with him and getting the honor of participating in the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, and I think that is something that we've always got to be reiterating, because it is really easy to get the idea what's in it for me, and something, whatever that might be, other than like the reward is that relationship. Mm-hmm. The reward is that he's asked us to participate in seeing things grow, and it's a life that we can learn to live with him. And sometimes I think we can see this, we can get caught up on whatever extravagance is around and we can miss the reward itself.
Yeah. And this has come up in other parables we've talked about from slightly different perspective. I think last time we talked about this idea is that we can easily get caught up checking things off. We got our check mark. We did this, we did this, we did this. So we're kind of in, and we missed the point that Jesus doesn't want us to be active for activity's sake to get a check mark. He wants to have a relationship with us. This is saying that he doesn't want us to focus on the reward specifically. He wants the reward to be the relationship with him.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we look at the landowner, if he had not hired anybody else that day, those workers would have been perfectly happy with their pay and gone home happy.
Yeah.
It's only when they compared themselves to the others who were paid the same amount for less work that they became dissatisfied.
Well, and it also really, I think it can really call for us for compassion. You know, if you put ourselves in the place of these workers, especially the first workers.
Yeah.
You know, and what you've kind of set us up as we were looking at this, the idea of this could be hard. You could take many days or however long and not have any kind of work, therefore being really destitute and taking whatever you can and probably losing stuff because, you know, of bad intentioned landowners. And here's a sort of like, now you have this chance where you know how hard it is, and just to be happy, like I'm really glad that they've received something so amazing, because I know how hard this is, and I know that I've been struggling, you know, of this, and I was so happy for today, and I'm so happy that, you know, that they'll be able to put food on the table tonight.
And I think that's what Jesus is addressing, is our motivation for doing what we do on behalf of the kingdom of heaven. It's not to get the reward. It should come from a place of gratitude, like you say. I haven't been able to feed my family for a few days. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to work and earn a full day's wage. It's you know, the guy even, you know, who worked for an hour wasn't expecting to get a full day's wage.
No.
So I think there is that sense that if we look at other parables where Jesus was comparing people who had been forgiven a little and forgiven a lot, who's going to be more thankful?
Yeah.
Well, the guy is going to be super thankful that worked only an hour to get a full day's wage. He's going to be able to feed his family for a full day and not just get enough to maybe feed himself to be able to work again.
A few scraps here and there,
or be able to feed his children and himself go hungry that day. So I think there's an interesting thing that happens right after this. So Jesus, right after this, reiterates what we've talked about in the previous podcast, which is that he's keeps reminding his disciples that he's has to go into Jerusalem, he has to die, he has to come back to life and return to heaven. And he barely gets those words out of his mouth. And we have this really interesting story where James and John's mother comes and asks Jesus if they can sit at his right hand and left hand. And that sort of gets all the other noses of the disciples out of joint, and they start arguing about who's the greatest. And I'm thinking, we just had this parable,
moms,
and they don't, and moms, and they still don't quite get what Jesus is saying. And so they're still looking for the perks. And then so Jesus again gets them together and And in verse 25 of Matthew 20 he goes, "But Jesus called them together and said, 'You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you,'" that's his followers, "it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be the first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man, that's Jesus referring to himself, came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Yeah, so it does. The amount of times, this topic comes up, clearly they keep missing the message.
So yeah, the parable, the metaphor isn't working anymore. So Jesus pretty much says straight to them, his followers who participate in his kingdom will have to be different than how the world or culture works. And that's still the way it works today. Mm-hmm. People in authority tend to give out commands to people under them. Yeah. And yes, you can have a good boss, but you still know who's in charge and who makes the decisions. And people aspire to have it, to be that. People who have wealth and status flaunt it, and the rest of us want to get it. It's competitive. And I think that's what you mentioned a few minutes ago, was it's that competition and comparison that makes us dissatisfied.
Yeah, and it puts, when we live that way, we put almost all the focus on ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's not really what is maybe best for anyone else necessarily, or other people, especially other people that we really, really need it, and we're okay with that as long as we,
it doesn't affect us.
It doesn't affect us at all, and it's sort of like, really in all this sort of the idea is like, hey, there is a reward. Like if you go back to the parable, like, I mean, they got the full day's wage. Mm-hmm. You didn't lose anything in that moment. I think it's that whole idea is that it's got to be more than just promoting ourselves. Yeah. That's not what we're doing. It's like, can we promote those around us?
Yeah. And that's where we have to check our motivation, because that's what I think this is pointing to, is we have to look at what is our motivation. So, Jesus points out that his followers will be known as people who serve others. Mm-hmm. So if we link that back to the parable, it's because we are grateful to be in relationship with Jesus, and that we serve from a place of gratitude rather than just doing it to seek a reward. And to me, that's kind of like a great leveler. We're all in the kingdom. We're all equal in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus really does have an upside down kingdom. There's not the hierarchy that we expect in a kingdom. Yeah. It's the first will be last and the last will be first. So again, I think it's those who are first in this world, they seek reward for reward's sake will be last. And those who are last, those who serve others, will be first.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us. And if you've gone through this parable with us, please continue this conversation. Maybe there's something in it that we didn't even talk about, or we didn't mention, and has jumped out at you. And we really appreciate knowing that. Feel free to comment in the comment section of just anything that, hey, this is something that really hit me, not even just based on something we said, just something you read in the parable itself. And take some time. There are some notes that you can see that will be linked. Take some time and we can meet together with your missional community, with friends, have that conversations, and then just encourage each other to really, to not maybe fall in the trap that we kind of talked about, that Jesus needs to repeat himself many times. Jesus repeats himself to us many times, but hopefully there's a point where he can just say, okay, you're catch it.
Yeah.
And just as we can try to live some of this out and grow and really be people who want to build God's kingdom right here on earth. Mm-hmm. So thank you again for joining us. Please like and subscribe. Have a great day.